Audiobook Masters, listen to your imagination.
Land of My Ancestors, written by Bothlale Tema and narrated by Bunolo M. 1. For days on end, a dry southeaster raged, riding rough's hold over wisps of clouds that dared to gather in the sky. Parched of all crop and green, the fields lay abandoned at the bottom of the valley. The wind lifted the loose red soil from the empty fields and suspended it like a curtain against the rocky hills on which the village of Moleji nestled. Too weak to move, the cattle spent their hours lying under the few thorn trees that withstood the inhospitable weather. Occasionally, they staggered up to pick up at the sour needle leaves like goats. Plows and hoes lay idly under the piles of tired soil in Moleji backyards. It had not rained for 2 seasons in a row. Small rock stock died daily. At first, the people secretly celebrated the unexpected supply of meat, which was normally a delicacy reserved for special occasions. But soon, they found themselves unable to deal with all of it. The women tried to dry some, but it was simply foolish to leave it hanging outside in the hot and gritty wind. Rotting carcasses began to accumulate, and an acrid stench lingered in the air, defying the invading southeaster. A blanket of doom hovered over Moleji, with no sign of subsiding. Chief Moloto was concerned. This was no ordinary drought, he thought. There was too much malice in the howling wind, which left no life in its wake. It could speak only of one thing: serious ancestral wrath. Feeling inadequate about approaching his ancestors on his own, he summoned his advisors to a meeting at his khotla one morning. 10 representatives attended, 1 for each clan, taking their rightful seats in the khotla circle, with the most senior, Mabona and Letswalo, on either side of the chief. By special instruction, no one brought their usual pieces of leather to work on during the meeting. The chief wanted their full attention. With a quick cursory greeting, he went straight to the point. Men, I've called you to come and help me look at the disaster that has gripped our village, he announced. In all my life, I have never experienced drought as ferocious as this. The forefathers are not pleased. The men stirred uneasily at the suggestion, which they knew the chief would not make lightly. It was only in times of serious trouble that such conclusions were drawn. What is this misdemeanor behind it? The chief asked, raising his voice to gain the khotla's attention. Will we ever be able to heal this rift between ourselves and our departed? Chief Moloto stopped suddenly and hung his head for a while, his sizable belly heaving now and again. His men, fearing an angry response to any untimely intervention, were still. Finally, He raised his head and adjusted his leopard skin cloak as he called for comments. The gathering bubbled into life as the men muttered among themselves, offering various reasons for the drought. Sefara, an ambitious man who was ever eager for the chief's approval, leapt up to speak. The ancestors never turned their backs on us for no reason, he said shrilly. Our hands are soiled. We must cleanse them. That, Sefara, is clear enough for all to see. Anyone with half the brain of a dying dog can tell you that. The question is, what have we done to bring this upon ourselves? Again, the men turned to one another, muttering over the matter, until Mabona, a rather wordy counselor, stepped in to make his point. Chief, your words have hit the truth, he began. It pains me that your trusted doctor, Mapadimule, has been so unsuccessful in getting reprieve from your ancestors. I feel our situation is dire enough to require unusual measures. We are caught between the horns of an ox. We have, on this hand, our tribal pride. Mabona gestured with his right hand, and in unison, the gathering titled their heads following his action. And on this hand, the communal gaze turned to the left. There is our survival. But if we look at it plainly, our choice, chief and dear compatriots, is simple. Mabona, the chief barked with irritation. Stop going round in circles like a sick cow. Come to the point. Lion of the North, my point is this, he responded. I think we should drop our pride and enlist the help of the one whose skills are known far and wide. Queen Mujaji of the Balubedu, the ultimate rainmaker. Suddenly, he paused to check the response and quickly added, I humbly submit that you consider calling her to come to our aid. Slowly, without moving his head, the chief turned his gaze to the left where Mabona was sitting. His squint right pupil almost disappearing under his nose. He flicked his whisk and thrashed an invisible fly rather violently. Mabona, I can see that you do not know me well, he growled, narrowing his eyes to the size of a cobra's. What gives you the idea that I can hand over the responsibility bestowed on me by my forebears to some, he flicked his whisk again, this time in Mabona's direction as if to fling him out of his sight. In this village, continued. I alone can intercede for my people. The day some stranger takes over this duty, my body will be lying cold and dead on the floor. I hope I shall never hear this foolish, if not downright wicked suggestion ever again. You are lucky, Mabona, that all your animals are dead, or I would have fined you to the last one. Mabona's cousin Letsoalo quickly jumped in to cool the brewing quarrel. Chief, let us not get sidetracked, he said, steering the chief's gaze away from Mabona. In my opinion, our indiscretion is not hard to find. It's been 3 years since we last sent boys out to the mountain school, not since the rumor began. We must expect to pay for violating our tradition. The forefathers will not smile at this. As soon as Letsoalo made mention of the issue, 2 other men stood up to confirm the effect of this rumor, causing a loud murmur to erupt in the khotla. A rumor about strangers abducting children was running wild in the villages, with the result that parents simply refused to let their children out of their sight, disrupting the lifestyle and education traditions of the village. Word came first from the village of Bothlale that young women collecting their water from the river and herd boys had simply and inexplicably disappeared. Similar whispers came from surrounding villages. Tsi, Lala, quiet, the chief commanded. Letsoalo, yours are sensitive words. Even though I understand what you are saying, we must be careful not to antagonize our people. We cannot ignore their fears. The men stared back at the chief in stony silence, clearly worried about the difficult situation they were facing. Satisfied that he had at least consulted his advisors for a solution, the chief closed the meeting with the conclusion that it was now time to approach the ancestors with his trusted guide and Dr. Mapodimule. Mapodimule was responsible for opening communication with the departed spirits of the village and shared with the chief the responsibility for rain-making. Just before sunset, the chief sent out an emissary to request a consultation. The doctor had been expecting the chief's call since hearing of the extraordinary meeting earlier in the day, and he had his special costume prepared for the occasion. As the sun set, he slowly adorned himself in suitable ritual attire. He placed his lion skin upon his head and swathed his arms in armbands made up of a selection of feathers from the birds of the marshes. Next, he circled his wrists in a variety of bracelets that had been fortified in secret potions. These would strengthen his hands for successful handling of the cowrie shell. Finally, he slipped his feet into the leather sandals made from skin drawn from the forehead of one of the chief's dead oxen. Before stepping out of his hut, Mapadimule took a bite of a bitter root to focus his mind and cupped his face in his hands for a minute, dispatching his spirit to alert the ancestors of the meeting. Then he grabbed his divination bag and made his way to the chief's homestead. Mapodimule entered the chief's compound through the back entrance. Before stepping out of his hut, Mapodimule took a bite of a bitter root to focus his mind and cupped his face in his hands for a minute, dispatching his spirit to alert the ancestors of the meeting. Then he grabbed his divination bag and made his way to the chief's homestead. Mapodimule entered the chief's compound through the back entrance and headed straight to the secret hut, which was especially reserved for these types of meetings. The chief was waiting for him patiently in front of a small fire burning in the middle of the hut. This was a special fire made from dry branches of willow trees that grew on the banks of a local stream. Mapodimule settled himself down opposite the chief and greeted him. "Chief, your servant has heeded your call." "Men of Bakwena," the chief started, without lifting his eyes from the fire. "I don't have to explain the reason for my call. Our forefathers have turned their backs on us. Throw light on it so that we can make amends." Mapodimule squatted and laid out his divination mat. He then shook his cowrie shell in the pouch and swiftly blew into it. He threw it down to have a first read. The doctor raised his eyebrows. He was not impressed. "That's just the first pulse," he consoled himself, quickly collecting the bones and cupping them in his hands. Slowly, he blew into his palms, at the same time pleading with the chief's ancestors for a clearer vision. To get their support, Mapodimule asked the chief to blow onto the bones as well, while he called out to the chief's ancestors' names, one after another, as far back as he could remember. Once he'd completed the lineage, he threw down the bones for the first true reading. Mapodimule groaned. "Chief of Bakwena, son of Ramunumane," he sighed. "I do not like what I see." He adjusted his seat to make himself more comfortable and leaned forward to examine them more closely. Still, he wasn't happy with their configuration, and so he decided to adjust his vision. Mapodimule dipped his fingers into his bag and collected a pinch of herbs which he threw into the fire. A greenish flame leapt up and a thick black smoke billowed, stinging their eyes. Mapodimule's eyes widened, stretching their socket muscles. He shook his head. "My master, if you will allow me to have time alone with them," he cried. Without a word, Chief Muloto stood up and went to bed.